The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. This is the prose title, and it is written by Frederick Douglass. Okay. Now I am given the sum up or the summary of this topic. The narrative begins with Douglas explaining that he was born in Talbot County, Maryland, but did not know his birthday because such information was often kept from slaves, which was lamentable and bothersome to him throughout his life. He rarely saw his mother, and the identity of his father was unknown, although it was commonly assumed to be his first master, Captain Anthony. So, Anthony was a moderately wealthy slaveholder and was not particularly kind or uh, conscientious. He is rarely interfered when his overseers treated his slaves brutally. Anthony was the clerk and superintendent for Colonel Lloyd, one of Maryland's wealthiest slaveholders. His plantation home was known as the Great House Farm, where Douglas resided when he was very young. Slaves received scanty allowances and had little time of their own. Many were also cruelly beaten by the overseers. However, slaves on the outlying farms spoke highly of Great House Farm and considered it an honor to be sent there on earth. Douglas detailed the sumptuous gardens of Colonel Lloyd's plantation and provided further information about the realities of slavery. He explained why slaves often praised their masters. They were afraid that the whites to whom they were speaking would report their insolence and they would be punished. Douglas also wrote of the wild and mournful beauty of the slave songs and how they suggested the horrors of slavery. Douglas did not have many tasks on Colonel Lloyd's plantation. He was often cold and hungry. Thankfully, it was announced one day that he, amongst several slave children, was chosen to live with Antony's son-in-law's brother, Ho- sorry, Hog Earl in Baltimore. Douglas attributed this fortuitous event to divine intervention. He knew God meant for him to one day escape the bonds of servitude. Douglas's new mistress, Mrs. Old, was sweet and untouched by the destructive effects of chivalry. He refused to treat him ill and even decided she would teach him how to read her husband. However, knowing the effects of teaching a slave to read, intractability, unmanageability, disillusionment, forbade her from doing so. Douglas decided he would teach him how to read and write. This he did by learning from the Baltimore Street Boys and using the Old Thorns copybooks to practice writing. Douglas attained a copy of the Columbian Orator, which provided him with writings on the emancipation and the denunciation of chivalry. After Captain Anthony died, his assets, including all the slaves, were divided amongst two of his children. Thankfully, Douglas was able to remain with Master Hogg, but this was short lived. A quarrel between Hogg and his brother Thomas resulted in Douglas being sent to live with Thomas instead. He was not said to go as drink and the realities of slavery had ruined Mr. and Mrs. Haggard respectively, but living with Master Thomas was not pleasant either. Thomas was ignorable, cowardly, cruel, and virulently hypocritical in his faith. He and Douglas did not have a good relationship, and the latter was sent to work on the farm of Edward Covey, the famed slave breaker known for taming slaves. Living with Covey was the low point of Douglas' life. He was beaten frequently in the most unjust manner conceivable. He lost his desire to read and improve his intellect, and his spirits were broken. Covey was a most abnormal man. He was duplicitous, merciless, fickle, and capable of savage brutality. One day, Douglas was very ill and could not complete his labor. This drew the attention of Covey, who beat Douglas until he was nearly senseless. Douglas resolved to journey to Master Thomas and beg him to protect him against Covey. Thomas was not uh, amenable to this decision, and Douglas had to travel back to the farm. On his way, he stopped at the house of a wife of a fellow slave, Sandy. Sandy gave Douglas a special route and promised him that if he kept this route at his side, he would never be touched again by a slaveholder. Douglas was skeptical but took the road. When he arrived back at the farm, Covey once again came upon him and began beating him. Douglas resolved that he would resist this time, and for over 2 hours the men were locked in combat. Douglas did not actually fight Covey but physically resisted the man's attacks. Finally, Covey backed down and Douglas was free. For the during of his stay on the farm, Covey did not touch him, and Douglas believed it was his desire to keep his reputation that prevented him from turning Douglas in. This episode was the chief moment of Douglas's life. He viewed it as the time when he moved from being a slave to being a man. After a year with Covey, Douglas left and went to live on the farm of William Freeland. Freeland was the best master Douglas had. He was fair, honest, gave his slaves enough food and tools, and had no pretension to pity. Douglas started a Sunday school for nearly 40 slaves, teaching them how to read and write. As time passed, Douglas became increasingly aware that he was getting older and he was still a slave. He resolved to seize a plan to escape. Several of his friends decided to join the escape attempt, even though they were all aware of the possible dangers that awaited them. However, the plot was discovered and the escape attempt failed. Douglas and his friends were put into jail, and Douglas's spirit was profoundly depressed. Finally, he was released back into the custody of Hugh Old in Baltimore. When he returned to the city, he was allowed to be hired out to learn uh, caulking or waterproofing a sea. Caulking means waterproofing a sea. His first experience resulted in his being beaten by several white men, afraid they might lose their jobs to free blacks. Douglas went to another shipyard and worked diligently. Soon he was commanding high wages, but was bitter that he had to turn nearly all of them over to Master Hug. It was his taste of freedom and autonomy that revived with him the desire to escape, and he began to formulate a plan. In order not to rouse the suspicions of his master, he worked assiduously at his clerking. He was loath to leave his friends in Baltimore, but knew that the time was come for him to try and go to the north. Finally, he achieved this escape. However, he did not polish any details in the narrative as to not provoke danger to those who helped him or those who were still in slavery. He arrived in New York and was exultant at his independence. Almost immediately, though, he felt lonely and lost in the city. If not for David Ruggles, a man who was most helpful to slaves and free blacks, he would have had a much more difficult time. In New York, he was able to marry his love, Anna, and the two decided to move to New Bedford, where it was safer. There, Douglas found work and reveled in the ability to keep all of his works and take up the responsibilities of an independent man. He even changed his name from Frederick Bailey to Frederick Douglass. Douglass was suggested by a friend who had just read Lady of the Lake. Douglas experienced some prejudice working in New Bedford. He also began reading the prominent ab- uh, abolitionist newspaper, the Liberator, and was in awe of its impassioned denunciations of slavery. One day he attended an anti-slavery convention in uh, Nantucket and was asked to speak. He took the stage, and although he was slightly nervous, he was able to tell his story. The narrative concludes with his explanation that he has been doing these very things ever since that fateful day. The appendix of the autobiography sets out Douglas' criticisms against the Christianity of slaveholders and explains to readers that Douglas is only critical of that very hypocritical type of religion, not religion in general. He